I want to take a little bit of time to talk about grief. I think it's appropriate to talk about right now as it's something that I am experiencing and working through. And sometimes I like to take my experiences and use that as kind of a guide to hopefully help other people who are going through something similar. So I hope this reaches somebody. Um, what I want to talk about, this is something that came up in a recent conversation with a family member, is the 5 stages of grief versus the dual process model. So, a lot of people, I think, it's one of those things that it kind of stands the test of time because it's so easily identifiable. And so in the 1960s, there was a model, the 5 stages of grief, that came out, and I've noticed that whenever people are talking about loss, they're like, "Oh, right now I'm experiencing depression. Right now I'm experiencing anger. Right now I'm experiencing denial." And so the 5 stages of grief are denial, bargaining, depression, anger, and acceptance. The issue with that, a lot of pushback over the last decade or so, has been that we have a range of emotions and moods that aren't really accounted for or acknowledged in the 5 stages of grief. The other thing is the lack of cultural competence in this particular model, because there is a finality in the stages. And so the last stage is acceptance. So there's 2 issues with that. The first issue is the acceptance that the person has passed on, that their life has ended, that there's no continuity. And the second issue with that is that one must acknowledge that there is no continuity of life. Now, culturally, there's a good number of people, and I'll just say specifically for Black people in America, around 90% of us acknowledge God, and therefore we acknowledge concepts like afterlife and heaven. And so it kind of goes up against that a little bit. And especially for me, as an Afro spiritualist, life for me does not end with the non-existence of the human body. There is the spirit, there's the afterlife, there's the crossing over process. There's a lot of things that happen after the body has ceased to operate or be animated in this realm. So in the 90s, there was another model that came out called the dual process model. And while the dual process model is a little bit less known and less popular, I would say that I personally find that it's more culturally competent. To me, it's more relevant to the human experience, and it acknowledges the range of emotions without actually throwing in any particular moods or descriptions of the said emotions in the model. So dual process model, the most straightforward way to describe it is that you have a loss-oriented space and you have a restoration-oriented space. So if you could think of it as 2 columns, in the loss-oriented space, that's where you're feeling the hurt, where you're talking about your loved one, you're talking about the things that you can no longer do. You can't touch them, you can't hold them. You're experiencing the loss of the things that they did for and with you. They might have been the chef of the family. They might have been the pillar, the matriarch, the patriarch. Who's going to take that role? So the loss-oriented space is where you're thinking and talking and processing the feelings associated with that. Some of the lesser known things, or the lesser acknowledged, or maybe even taboo, and I'll give this example in the form of a story, is the avoidance within the loss-oriented space. So in 2016, when I found out that my grandmother had passed away, I was towards, like, I think the end of an episode of Game of Thrones. There's probably 15 minutes left, and I looked at my phone, and I remember not feeling anything. I stared at the TV, I finished the episode, and I didn't say anything for like the next 15 to 20 minutes. And the person that I was sitting with was like, "Are you gonna talk about it? Like, are you gonna..." I could not process the information that I had just seen on my phone. So I avoided it. I avoided it for at least 30 minutes. And then finally, I just broke down crying. But in that very short period of time, a couple of things happened. So I went into restoration-oriented but in a very unhealthy way, is I didn't want to process it at all. And then I immediately swung back to loss oriented. And so avoidance is something that happens quite often. So the inability, the incapability, the lack of desire to even acknowledge that it happened until one is ready. And, within avoidance, there's a lot of things that can happen. You can dive into your work. You can be so work driven that you don't talk about it, you don't think about it. I think a lot of workaholics can probably relate to when you experience a loss, you just dive right into what you do have control of. You have control of a timetable, of your schedule, of tasks, and it's easier to just completely ignore is not the right word, but like distract yourself. The other thing that might happen that's maybe taboo or less talked about is hyperarousal. In this particular context, when I say hyperarousal, I understand that can be related to PTSD, so irritability, anger, anxiety, all of that stuff. I'm talking about literally hypersexual arousal, the increase of or preoccupation with sexual fantasies or actually acting out sexual behavior. I want to make that distinction before people kind of respond and they're like, hyperarousal is related to PTSD. It is. I'm talking about hypersexual arousal. Within avoidance, the desiring, the coveting of life. So you may have seen, some people joke about going to a funeral to meet somebody, but within that, like, ignore the joke for a moment. A person is so hurt, so crushed, and so in their loss that they are focusing more on just finding a mate, finding somebody to sleep with, to forget. You may start to experience how do I put it? You may start to think about the people in your life who, especially if you're biologically a woman, you're thinking of having a child, you may start to think about who you want, who is still alive, to witness seeing you have a child and getting to hold your child. So just for me personally, I started to think about my mom, and I was like, my mom should see my grandchildren. This was part of the restoration oriented, but also a piece of avoidance within the loss oriented. Like, was this actually something that I was thinking deeply about before the loss of my grandfather or before the loss of my grandmother? No, this is something that I think more intentionally about as everyone around me is aging. So it's not just increased feelings of sexuality. It may be the increased feeling of wanting to consume more food, of wanting to consume more alcohol. There's a lot of potential for addiction when this happens, and this is really important for you to pay attention to and seek professional help if needed, because you don't want to stay in that space. So in loss-oriented space, these are other things, which is why the 5 stages of grief is kind of like, it's not complex enough. We're too complex of beings, I think, to just minimize our experience to 5 stages, because there's so many things that we can do or not do to try and process grief. So then in restoration oriented, yes, there's still some distraction, but within the distraction, you're in a space where you're thinking about, here's what life looks like now without the person. So like I said, if it's the matriarch, if it's the person who cooked for the family, when you're in a restoration oriented space, you may find yourself being and thinking like, okay, I have to do the cooking now. I have to do the cleaning. I have to be the one to check in on all my family members. I might be the new matriarch, and I'm not saying I am. I'm saying, just as an example, these are the things that someone might be thinking or doing, like establishing new roles in your life, things that you do that you did not do or you would not even have considered if the person was still there. So that's restoration oriented. The other piece to dual process model, so we're thinking of it in two columns, loss oriented, restoration oriented, is oscillation. And so this may be the most confusing piece to accept for a lot of people, to go between that space where you're talking about it, you're feeling it, you're avoiding it, you got the hurt, the crying, the anger, all of that stuff, and then you're kind of swinging into the restoration oriented, where you're doing distractions, you're meeting new people, you're creating new social circles, you're creating hobbies that aren't related to the loss of the person or the thing, and you're creating this. You're stepping into this new identity. This happens sometimes simultaneously, and that's the piece that I really want to help people get to and accept, is that you do not have to feel obligated to think about the loss every single day, every single moment. I would actually venture to say that it's very unhealthy to put yourself in a space where all you do is sit in loss and feel it and hurt and all of that stuff. You should be oscillating between the two, because there's still life that has to go on. You still have to be able to take care of yourself. Maybe you have children, take care of your children, take care of your family, make sure the family is okay, keep the family going, like all this stuff. So if you find yourself in a space where, like, I've got to work to pay the bills and I need to focus for just these 8 hours and then I can go back to feeling, and you're going back and forth between the two, don't feel bad about it. Don't feel like, God, I really have to, I feel bad because I'm not thinking about it as much. Don't feel bad about that. You're supposed to be kind of going between the two and experiencing the two until you reach a point where, I don't know who came up with the quote. If I find it, I'll go ahead and put it in the video. But somebody said, "Grief doesn't shrink; you grow around it." And that, I think, is one of the most beautiful phrases. And if you just stop for a moment and think about it, right? For me, there may not be a place of acceptance for the people that I have lost in this physical space. I'm not going to get to hear my grandfather Percy play the saxophone ever again live. That hurts. I'm not going to sit and watch some trash TV with my grandma while shoveling a bunch of snacks and cereal in my mouth. Like that, to not be able to do those things, those small things that meant so much to me, that is probably always going to hurt. So this is another reason why while it's good to identify with some of the emotions in the 5 stages of grief, that is not the model that I teach people. It's not the model that I personally identify with. I identify with dual process because of how complex we are, and that people might not reach a space of acceptance. It's something that you may start off with a space of, okay, this happened, and it's kind of a flat acceptance, right? But really that's maybe some denial within loss oriented, and then you get to a space where this happened and it's terrible and it hurts. That's more of a The final thing that I would like to add is that there are many things that we grieve over. Grief is not something that is life or death only. Yes, within life, there is death. That's inevitable. I think we spend a lot of time just avoiding that fact, which is why grief may be something that's really shocking to the system when a death actually occurs. However, there are many things that we grieve over. So you may grieve over the loss of a friendship, over the loss of a job. Many people experience symptoms of grief over the loss of a job. You may experience grief over pets passing away. Those are near and dear to us. They're our family. Many people can relate to is the current pandemic that we are experiencing, COVID-19. And in that, a lot of people are thinking of, what life was like before. For younger people, it may feel like, I used to be able to sit in the classroom with my friends without having to wear a mask or socially distance. And for those of us who prefer to work in an office, it's that loss of having that community of going into a space and working with people every day. So these are examples of non-death related grief. I'm gonna go ahead and end this video with a list of resources for you if you are currently experiencing grief. So some resources for groups and some hotlines if you are having thoughts or feelings of harming yourself. I hope you take care of yourself, and I hope that this video has been useful to you.